Motorola has held the crown for best cheap smartphone with its Moto G devices for a really long time now, and we just got two new ones to play with here in the United States, the Moto G6 and the Moto G6 Play. They're both meant to keep Motorola's reputation for great cheap phones going, but they do handle things a little bit differently, so let's take a closer look. Let's start with the more interesting of the two, which is the Moto G6. Right up front, you can tell that Motorola is trying something a little different with its displays. We're looking at what they're calling a max vision display, which means it has an 18:9 aspect ratio. It's a little taller than you might be used to if you're coming from a Moto G5, but that's going to be well worth it. The longer aspect ratio means the phone itself is more comfortable to hold for long periods of time, and it does also mean we've got a lot more screen to work with. I was also pleasantly surprised by the amount of power that's on display here. Motorola chose to go with one of Qualcomm's Snapdragon 450 chipsets. That's an octa-core chipset with clock speeds of up to 1.8 gigahertz, and you can get that with either 3 or 4 gigabytes of RAM, depending on where you're getting this phone from and what you're willing to shell out. The version we played with had 4 gigabytes of RAM, and altogether it felt remarkably smooth. It's not nearly as smooth as a Galaxy S9, but I don't think anyone looking to spend $250 for a phone is going to be let down by what is on offer here. Throw in a mostly stock Android Oreo experience, and we've got a device that kind of hits all of the high points for a Moto G device. It's inexpensive, it runs pretty clean Android, and it does run surprisingly well. Motorola has decided to take the Moto G series to the next logical step in its evolution, and they gave it a dual camera, specifically a 12 megapixel camera paired with a 5 megapixel camera wrapped up in a tidy housing around the back. It looks a lot like the Moto X4 from last year, which I was actually really fond of, and I'm glad to see that design hasn't gone anywhere. If anything, it's actually gotten a little bit smoother and a little bit more subtle and professional. I'm a big fan, even though I miss the Moto Maker days where you could just make a hideous smartphone and rock it all day long. The phone's back is made out of Gorilla Glass 3, which should protect it from most drops and scuffs. That said, we're still working with a glass body, so if you drop this thing one too many times, expect that glass to do not very well. So yeah, the camera. Dual cameras have become sort of unavoidable, and I'm actually pretty pleased with Motorola's interpretation here, if only because it doesn't try to do anything crazy. It'll do portrait modes surprisingly well. I took this photo of our friend from CNET. You can control the amount of blur in the background after the fact. To my surprise, this camera actually does really well. It has an f1.8 aperture, and though it doesn't have the super fast dual pixel autofocus that we saw in certain versions of the G5 and the G6 Plus, which we're not getting in the United States, colors turn out vibrant and there was a lot of detail and surprising amounts of crispness. I'm super okay with getting this kind of camera performance in a $250 phone. As with other phone makers though, Motorola is trying to build some AI into its camera. So if you have the landmarks and object databases downloaded, you could theoretically point your Moto G6 at a landmark and the phone will populate the screen with information about it for you to sift through. Ditto for objects. We tried pointing the phone at an apple, and even though it wasn't a great looking apple, the phone still returned results from Wikipedia and online sources and gave us the option to maybe even go buy this thing online, which works surprisingly well. This is stuff that LG and Samsung and lots of other companies have tried to varying degrees of success, and here it is in a sub $300 phone working actually pretty okay. I wish I could say the same for the landmark stuff though. I pointed it at the Freedom Tower, which might be the single most identifiable monument in New York City, and got nothing. So yeah, the Moto G6 is actually kind of a great cheap phone, as you'd expect from a company that's made its name most recently for making good cheap phones. The Moto G6 Play, however, is a step in a different direction, and if you're familiar with the Play line in general, none of this will be a surprise. It's a slightly less expensive option that trades a lot of the frills for pure power, specifically battery. We're looking at a 4,000 milliamp hour battery here, which to be fair is huge, but not the biggest Motorola has put in a phone recently, and they say you'll be able to get 36 hours off a single charge, which, you know, I'll believe it when I see it. Beyond that, we're looking at a 5.7-inch LCD running at 720p just to make sure that power consumption is down to a minimum. There's also a Qualcomm Snapdragon 427 chipset in here, which should keep things going relatively smoothly. Just don't try to throw too many big games at it. PUBG on a device like this is just gonna be a no-no. This is a more traditional kind of Moto G device. It's less expensive at $199. It doesn't have some of the frills, but it gives you everything you need to get through a day and then some without too much trouble. And that's really what some people are looking for. Motorola's split here between the feature richness of the Moto G and the pure practicality of the Moto G6 Play is going to be interesting to see play out over time, especially when you consider that Motorola's E-series, their cheapest phones ever, are actually getting really good, and we're going to see some overlap there over time too, I'm sure. That said, the competition for cheap smartphones is only getting stronger, and we've seen some strong options already this year, so as big a fan of the Moto Gs as I am, we're going to have to see how well these things stack up when we get full review units and when we see the rest of the competition bring their A game to the table.